Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
So there is an election going on. We wanted to attempt a bit of science to get a picture of the range of issues on social media. We're having millions of tweets analysed by experts, two bearded experts, it has to be said, from the think tank Demos. They're looking out for election gossip, stories and banter that are dominating, or as we are loosely calling it, what's the chatter? Demos experts have picked at random 2,000 Twitter accounts to follow 400 supporters of each of the five main parties. And today we are talking about echo chambers. What are they? We'll have a look at this. Okay, well, let's talk now to Josh Smith. He's the stats guy at the think tank Demos, and his colleague Jamie Bartlett, both here to tell us what the data means. Welcome. I know that you enjoyed Norman's chat on beards just a moment ago. Let's talk, though, more about the echo chamber, because we heard there the principle, Josh, and I know that you wanted to find out whether that affect's going on with the 2,000 people that you're following. That's 400 supporters from each of the main parties. So you've generated a chart, and just explain what we're looking at here.
So what you're looking at here, and as said, we were interested not only in what people were saying, but who they were talking to, what those conversations were. And each of these dots on this graph is a user on Twitter, and each line represents a conversation. So if I tweet to you, you will get a notification that I'm talking to you, but you will also be connected by a line on this graph. Mm-hmm. Now, the only thing that determines where these users are on this graph is who they're talking to and how much. We've coloured them by party, but that's what's determining their position. And the really interesting thing that we've seen coming out here, and this is 1.5 million tweets over the election period, is that people are generally grouping by their parties. Mm-hmm. This effect kind of varies depending on the parties. Labour and Conservatives are grouped together, but they're a little bit more spread out than the three other parties that we've been looking at.
And so that's specifically then where you're identifying the echo chamber going on, the Lib Dems, the SNP and UKIP?
Yes, so that's where we've seen this effect strongest. So you can see, and if we remove Labour and Conservative from that graph, you can see that while there are conversations going on between these clusters, they're much, much denser within themselves. Mm-hmm. So most of the chatter within each of these parties are to the party faithful, are to people who kind of share the same things. So
Jamie, tell us what you've identified about what the people in those three parties are sharing.
Well, so taking our sort of little clusters and taking our samples of 200 from each of these parties, we were looking at the tweets that were the most shared mm-hmm. within them. So I think the first one comes from the SNP here. So this was the most shared within the SNP group. And as you can see, this is fairly inward-looking. Essentially, it's Nicola Sturgeon saying that Alex Salmond was right by saying that the Labour manifesto is essentially a rip-off of some SNP policies. Very popular among SNP supporters, that.
OK, so that was reverberating around that one. But
Yeah.
what about the Liberal Democrats?
And a sort of similar one, a sort of self-congratulatory tweet essentially here from the Liberal Democrats. This was the most shared within that cluster, and it's essentially again Tim Farron's vision to change Britain, and apparently the voters were loving it.
They're all on message. What about UKIP?
Well, this was quite interesting actually, because the UKIP one was actually not really, in effect, directly about the election. It was, if you like, a bit more on the core territory of UKIP. It was about a terrorism case in court and about face veils. So it was strangely, and I don't know what you quite draw from that, maybe that the focus isn't solely on the election for UKIP. This was a little bit of an outlier, if you like. It was about a broader issue than this election.
That's interesting. Josh, you've found, as we mentioned, that supporters of Labour and the Conservatives are talking to each other far more. So if we look at the tweets that they're sending, the map looks a bit different. They're engaging in debate with each other more, aren't they?
Absolutely, and again, the shape here is interesting. So these clusters are much closer together. There's much more connecting these two parties than we saw with the other three parties earlier. And they were focusing mainly on the same issues. So this, in this last week, for example, everyone's talking about Eurovision, so both of the parties were bringing that up. The Labour manifesto, again, is a big topic of discussion here. So more, you know, there's still groupings, but there's more talk between them.
OK, so pick up, Jamie.
Eurovision is a cross-party issue.
Obviously, that's the key issue at the moment. What else?
Well, the big story really, I think, last week politically was ransomware. Which, of course, as we saw, was this piece of malware that was infecting computers and was causing trouble, particularly for the NHS, because it was locking files that had to be decrypted. So ransomware was being talked about by all of the parties. One of the most popular, I'm not sure if we're going to get it up, yes, one of the most popular tweets of all was this one from Paul Mason about, you know, should we be upgrading Trident when we can't even seem to fix an exploit in Windows XP. So a sort of question of priorities about security. Windows XP was the problem which resulted in some of the ransomware, and this was especially popular with SNP voters, probably because of the Trident aspect.
And with the cyber attacks seen as an opportunity for the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, because that was a lot of the traffic among
Yeah, exactly. So among Labour supporters, it was this one that was most shared relating to the ransomware attack. And this is the really interesting thing. You know, the received wisdom in electoral politics is if we're talking about the NHS, Labour's winning. That's what strategists have always thought. And interestingly, Labour supporters on Twitter were more likely to be talking about this ransomware than those from the Conservative Party. And they especially focused on the fact that Jeremy Corbyn had been speaking about attacks that very morning on the NHS from things like malware.
And interesting, the Tories didn't engage much on this issue.
Yeah, or not in any way the same volume. And I think that's partly for the same reason that I think the Labour Party wants to get the conversation onto the NHS, and this was a way to do it. Where they did talk about this, and I think this reflects the strengths of the different parties as they perceive it themselves, is that Conservative supporters on Twitter were just sharing information about it being an international cyber attack. It wasn't only the UK targeted. So that kind of puts the conversation onto security, national security, where I think the Conservatives feel more confident. So, you know, in a sense, Twitter is a very useful place for these parties to take the big issues of the day and then spin them in the way that they think works for them.
Josh, reveal the biggest tweet of the week, the most retweeted of the 2,000 accounts that you've been looking at.
So our absolutely top tweet, and this was picked up by every party except for the Conservative Party. A couple of people retweeted it. Everyone else absolutely loved it. Someone has noticed that the bus that Theresa May is currently touring the country in is exactly the same bus, if you look at the licence plate, that was kind of flagging up the Vote Remain campaign just a few months ago. And this is potentially a side of the campaign that Theresa May would like to be forgotten. Obviously, she was on Remain's side back then.
It's like a perfect tweet, this, because it's clever and it's funny, and you can't get
simple.
And it's simple, and you can't get away with anything on Twitter. There's so many people out there watching your every move, and one mistake and it'll get picked up and shared really widely.
Thank you both, Josh and Jamie. Thank you.